Hi, I'm Doug Bland. I'm Executive Director for Arizona Interfaith Power and Light, which is a spiritual response to the climate crisis. And I'm here today with David Wells. He teaches since 1998, I believe, at ASU, public policy and organizational leadership. And then he was one of the founders and is the public policy director at the Grand Canyon Institute. So David, really great to have you with us today.
Yeah, glad to join you.
We'll be interviewing him, and this is a part of a series that we're doing of different movers and shakers in our state that we're interviewing on a variety of different topics that are listed in a faith climate values guide that I've put up on the screen, a link. We're doing two things. We think that this coming election is going to be such a critical one, both for the sake of our planet, the future of our planet, and the future of democracy, that we're encouraging people to, number one, vote. So you can pledge to vote and vote with climate justice in mind. And the second thing is you can download the Values Voters Guide that covers a number of different issues, including the one we're talking about today, an inclusive economy, and also issues like a moral healthcare system in the midst of pandemic, and climate care and climate justice, and dignity of LGBTQ people, and a variety of other issues. We're taking a different approach than we might ordinarily take. We want to talk about the issues, but the way we're getting at the issues in these videos is through storytelling. We think that though we like to think we're rational beings who make decisions based just on the data, the fact is we're storytelling beings, and we make decisions with our hearts as much as our heads. And we make decisions based on the affiliations we have. We're tribal people, so we make decisions based on the connections we have and the deeply felt relationships that exist in our lives. So we're asking people that we're interviewing, including David today, to tell stories about how it was, what experiences in his life, what events helped shape him to be the kind of person that he is, and to care about the issues that he cares about. And of course, we're hoping as we listen to David's stories and other stories that we're also thinking about our own narratives that have shaped us. They say that every novel is really autobiographical, that we read the novel to try to figure out who we are and not just find out what happened with this character in their life and experience. So David, we'll get to some of the issues a little bit later, but first start by telling us something about the events, the experiences, maybe back to your childhood that shaped you to care about the things that you care about today.
I think the one thing I remember earliest, when I was growing up, my dad was a superintendent of schools, and although I was born in the same hospital as George W. Bush in New Haven, Connecticut, we moved to Portland, Maine when I was pretty small. And I can remember at that time we attended a congregational church. And I remember there was one Sunday after church that there was a woman who was in distress that we picked up off the street. And to me, she was a complete stranger. And she took her to our house, and we played games and we did things, and I had fun with her. I remember that, but it really stuck with me that they had picked up a stranger off the street. Now, I later learned that that wasn't true. I mean, she actually attended the church, and I mean, she was in distress, but it's not somebody who was a complete stranger. But to me, that was this connection with somebody who I didn't have any connection with, and that my parents cared a lot about it. And then so that was sort of, within me as growing up, but mostly growing up in suburban area and other folks like that. And then I went to college at Bucknell University, which is also in a rural part of Pennsylvania. And I had taken a vocational test, and because I did well in school, but I really liked math and I really liked government, because when I was in first grade, I had memorized all of the presidents by name. And by second grade, this is all because the neighbors had given us little statuettes of the presidents and a little booklet. I'd memorized the years they were in office. So I was, had that down, and so they fed into that. And so anyway, so they said economics was something I should consider majoring in. So I said that sounds like a good idea. So unbeknownst to me, though, economics is usually a area where people have a pretty strong individualistic ideologies, and you learn to be sort of self-interested and so forth. And unbeknownst to me, at Bucknell, we had all of these what we both what we call institutional and Marxist and liberal economists. So so the liberal economists were the most right wing of the bunch, and they moved farther left from there. That was just by happen chance. But from there, I became grounded in things to think about things like social class and things like that. And and when I went to grad school at USC, I then lived in Los Angeles, and then I actually got to see things in a whole new light that I had never really experienced, when there are real urban problems and a real microcosm of the world in Los Angeles. So those are all things that really helped transform me in terms of the way I became really active into social issues.
I remember one story that I heard you tell about a professor that cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars in your lifetime. Say a little bit about that.
Yeah, so Charles Zachary was an economics professor at Bucknell. Unfortunately, he passed away. I was thinking about trying to reconnect with him again. I had occasionally, but he passed away last year, although he had dementia at the time, so it wasn't in that sense I could have really reconnected. But so Charles was a Marxist. He'd grown up in the 60s. He as a youth, he was in the 60s, so he was born in the late 30s, but became an activist in the 60s and a Marxist and a real activist. And I was really impressed with things that he did, because he made me aware of U.S. foreign policy and the CIA's activity to overthrow democratically elected governments, which totally blew my mind that suddenly that my government works always in my best interest. Now I found out that wasn't true. And then he was really active in with things with Central America. This is when Reagan was president, so he was involved in trying to overthrow at that time, the Sandinistas, which were a positive thing in Nicaragua, with the Contras, and also the Reagan administration was trying to quell the aspects of peasants who were trying to rebel in El Salvador, both in vicious ways. And understanding Cuba in a different light, that Cuba's a mixed bag, but Cuba, had emphasized education and healthcare in ways that other developed countries didn't. So he just really made me committed to the idea that I wasn't going to become a corporate worker, that I wasn't going to work that 9-to-5 corporate job, which I certainly could have been capable of doing. I could have likely had salaries that were well into the 6 figures if I had pursued that, and I didn't do that. I ended up thinking I was going to work at a liberal arts college, and then I ultimately ended up at ASU, which actually turned out to be better in terms of my political work. But yeah, he's cost me hundreds of thousands of dollars. I'm very grateful for it in that sense. But
that's a great story. So, as you know, we're using the approach to storytelling of Marshall Gantz, who invites us to think of the story of self that has been so influential to us, also the story of us. So who are the kindred spirits? Who's the community that you turn to when you need inspiration or support or whatever? So who would you name as the us that has been important for you?
Well, I think back to, I think part of it was my parents. I don't know what it was with my parents exactly, because they weren't that political, but there was something that they infused in me, because I remember there was a guy who ran for, there was a guy on our school board, and we used to take band trips, and he would always vote against our band trips on the school board. We'd raise money and stuff like that. And he didn't send his kids to the school. So when my dentist ran for the school board, I worked really hard on his campaign to make sure he won. And my dentist won. And there's something about that my parents instilled with me in terms of that dedication to stuff. And I often look historically, like, John Lewis has recently passed away, and you think about Gandhi and Martin Luther King, and I even think back, more intellectually, also to Marx in terms of, and Marx wasn't really an organizer per se, but he was more of a thought-provoking person who actually made people rethink the way the society worked. But when you think about the struggles that, because we think like King is super popular, but he certainly wasn't during his lifetime. And people have to struggle, and the idea that you have to actually really sometimes, be on sides that are not popular at the time. In retrospect, you might think, oh my gosh, everybody thought the Iraq War was horrible. Well, no, there are a few of us who are working really hard, and we had to, live through some pretty difficult times to try to stand up to that. So that those people I find a lot of inspiration in, and and certainly not super biblically connected, but Jesus was often making decisions that were counter to the norms of the culture that he grew up in, and that was sort of the challenge that he posed. So those are all things that that I've connected with, and there was a guy named Jim Driscoll when I moved here to Arizona who was really helpful. He helped get clean elections passed, and he was really a person I connected with and helped me get sort of connected, and still does, although he lives in the DC area now. So those are all some of the things that I touch base with, along with the contemplative spirit that I've picked up through the Quaker tradition.
Yeah, talk a little bit about Quakers. They're a small religious group of people, but they have an outside impact on the things that they do, working for justice and connecting people. Talk a little bit about your Quaker background and interest.
Yeah, so I'm what's called a convinced Quaker. I mean, I came to it because I was convinced that it was a good idea. And it started when I after I finished my PhD, I was taking visiting jobs teaching economics. And one of the jobs was at Earlham College, which is a small Quaker college in Richmond, Indiana, on the border of Indiana and Ohio. And I was really impressed there. I was impressed by their booklet about how they were sort of committed to social justice. And what was really interesting too is that the students there seemed to be also quite committed to that. And it's so in a different way than I'd been at a couple other liberal arts colleges, Whitman College, which was fine, and Denison, which I wasn't so keen about in terms of where the students were coming from. And I just was really impressed with, and also they made a real commitment to bringing diverse students to campus. But the faculty meetings were really weird because you'd go to the faculty meetings and they started in silence, because they actually did Quaker worship in the beginning of their faculty meetings. And I didn't understand what that meant. And I got to know some folks who were Quakers there. One was a wife who was a nurse who was of one of the faculty members, and we got involved in community issues. And she just kept, Ruth and Sam Neff are just really neat, and still are really neat people. They're in their mid-late 80s now. And she just said, you've got to go to a Quaker meeting. You got to go to a Quaker meeting. And I was unemployed the second year we were there, and it was really, I finally started going to the Clear Creek Quaker meeting at Stout Meeting House on the Earlham campus near the time before we left. And that's so when we got to Arizona, one of the first things that we looked for was where the Quaker meeting was. And so we've been quite involved with that. And what Quakers have done for me is they help me be more silent, because when you're active and trying to do social change. You can see that in the streets with the protests about police violence and so forth. People are often very angry, and anger isn't always a good place to come from. It's a good motivating thing, but you want to somehow control it and you want to see that of God in other people. And Quakers have sort of helped me become more contemplative and more thoughtful in terms of the actions that that we take. And so that's been sort of a helpful balancing force, because you do need to have that agitation and anger. And I think in some ways that society is not working the way it should be, and you've got to have something that moves you. But you have to also keep that under control and keep that sort of oriented in a good positive direction, so it doesn't take you or the group you're involved in a negative way. And Quakerism, by thinking of that as that of God and other people, has been quite helpful in that regard.
We are so divided as a culture with the culture wars, and it seems to be getting more and more hostile. You know, I was part of a Arizona Corporation Commission meeting yesterday, and like most meetings these days that I'm a part of, the decision-making falls on one side or the other, and it's very oppositional and confrontational. So when you're in the midst of a divisive, conflicted situation like that, what do you do to call on, you know, your Quaker recognition that there's that of the light of God in everybody, and there is, you know, the possibility of a third way, not just two ways?
It's hard, I'll tell you, because I remember like when I'm bicycling sometimes, and somebody would honk their horn at me in the sense that I didn't belong on the street. What I often would do when you get angry is I would just give them the finger. But what I tried to do instead was to try to wave to them and think they were saying hi to me. But so the idea is that you. I mean, I think you just have to pause. I think it's really important to do that. I mean, I don't do as many street protests as I used to do. I'm now doing more public policy, media relations kind of thing. So I'm a little bit removed from that. But it's just really important. And sometimes it's helpful to watch each other. Because I remember we were protesting when Madeleine Albright, who had sort of approved of the death of so many children in Iraq, saying the price was worth it during the time of sanctions. And I said, you know, I was trying to lead a chant saying, Madeleine Albright, not bright. A friend of mine he's Jewish, but he said is that you know, that's not very respectful. And this really stuck with me. And that's like 20 years ago. And so you just have to, you know, sort of just remind each other sometimes and be supportive of each other about what makes sense. But it's not an easy thing to do.
No. The other sort of different oppositional approaches that I think of is you either do public policy or you do individual actions. You emphasize one or the other. What good does it do to change light bulbs when what we need is environmental justice legislation? But you're a person who works with both public policy, and then you ride your bike all over town to reduce your carbon footprint. You're a vegetarian. So say just a little bit about the emphasis in your life and the importance of doing both public policy and individual actions.
Yeah, it became really important for me to try to walk the walk, so to speak. So like with the bike riding part, I always liked riding a bike. When I was a little kid, they gave me a little speedometer when I had a 3-speed bike, and I put it on there. And I remember we lived on it was sort of like a loop road, and I went around that loop about, I don't know, 50 times and it's just so I could watch the thing go over. And then when we moved to Los Angeles, it's a car culture there, and my dad thought it would be a great idea if we bought a house. So they provided the down payment, and we rented out to other folks and so forth. But we picked a house that was 7 miles away from USC. And one Sunday, I decided I would. They gave me a choice of 2 bikes I could have shipped, and I didn't know anything about bikes. I had a Raleigh or the Free Spirit I had, which was my favorite color. I picked the Raleigh, fortunately. That one day I biked 7 miles to USC on a Sunday, and I made it to the library and made it back. And then from there, because what I would be in class and I would see how the Hollywood sign I could see at the beginning of class, and it would just be obscured by smog by the end of class, and I just didn't want to be part of that. And so, and the same thing with my vegetarianism, which is now essentially veganism, is that I mean, the factory farms are just horrific in terms of how animals are treated. We wouldn't treat our dogs or cats the way we treat animals that people eat. And of course, there's also the health and climate change reasons, but it was ethical reasons that led me to it. And I just decided when I was it took me, I think, about 6 months where I said, I'm going to have to wean myself off meat. And so the January of my senior year, I stopped eating meat. And except for a couple flip ups in that first few months, I've done fine, except for occasional potlucks when I discover something's in there I didn't anticipate. But anyway, that's been really grounding for me. And then we live in Arizona, so I decided it would be neat to cook with the solar ovens, and I've worked with you on solar cookouts that we used to have, and that's sort of empowering. It doesn't, it's more symbolic, but it's really neat to have the sun cook things. So it's sort of been part of my lifestyle. So, now I make my own vegan milk. I make my own vegan cheeses. I have this, you'll see a crock behind me. So I made 20 pounds of sauerkraut in February. And so there's just a lot of things you can actually do. And I've even gotten back into baking bread since the COVID-19 thing struck. But there's just different things that you can do that sort of make your life more grounded. And so you're not, and you're living sort of the values that you most would like to do. And it's something that not everybody can easily do, because if your work hours are crazy or your income is really low and you don't have a choice about where you can live, then some of the choices that I have, are products of the privileges I have. So, so there are other people who have challenges that make that more difficult. But I think it's something everybody you have to think wherever you're coming from. What can you make work for you given where you're starting from? And you're going to start at a small spot and try to move beyond it.
Thank you. The other divisive argument that we hear again and again is between jobs and the environment. And I'm curious to know what your thinking is as an economist and as a person of faith. Both ecology and the economy are based on the same Greek word, oikos, household. So they've got so much in common with each other. And yet somehow they get split in our political discussions. Can you say a little bit about how you come down on that divisive argument between jobs and economy?
I think where it comes from is it has to do with change, right? So that the idea is if you're going to change your fuel sources, then that would mean the people who currently work in those industries are going to lose their jobs. And therefore, that's where I think the friction comes from. But that's what capitalism does. We have transformations are happening all the time in capitalism in terms of the way in which technologies disrupt things. And there's always resistance to those kind of things as they happen. So I think that's where it comes from, but it's just, as a general rule, it's just not really true. As you're opening up new possibilities, it's just that you need to make sure, and I think it's important, I think on the environmental front, to be trying to be as supportive as you can of people who might lose their jobs as a consequence. I mean, coal is disappearing on its own, despite what Donald Trump wants to do. And that's largely because it's just not economic anymore. But coal's also massively mechanized. I mean, there aren't very many people who work in coal mines like it used to be. So, so there aren't really that many jobs to be saved in coal per se. And then you have all these different new options in terms of changing the grid and getting into battery technologies with energy storage and solar, wind power, and all the thermoelectric and all the different things that we're going to eventually have to, and we are gradually transforming. So I don't think there's a real challenge. It's just a thing of change is going to mean people lose jobs. It's just like with healthcare, if we're going to reduce the cost of healthcare in this country, some of the people who work in that industry are not going to be employed there anymore. And people are going to resist that. So that's the thing. You need to be understanding of where people are coming from and trying to figure out ways in which you can be supportive of the transition so that people feel as they move from one phase of their life to something else that they're not totally left behind. Because historically, we've left people behind. People lose their jobs due to free trade, and we don't support them adequately, and they never get quite the same pay they used to get before. And hopefully, some of the ways in which we've changed public policy due to COVID might carry over because we've suddenly now think people who are unemployed need to have the full pay instead of half the pay they used to get. So there's a lot of things that are in, paid sick leave, things like that were off the map before are on it. So I think it's possible, that those kind of, as long as you're sensitive to those things, that you can find ways to make those two work together better.
That's very helpful. Thank you. So the third part of Marshall Gantz is the story of now, and with the election coming up soon, what are the crucial things that we should be thinking about, values that we might use to examine how we will vote and how we'll get politically involved now and in the fall, especially with the election coming up?
Well, I think, in all meetings you have, always think about people who aren't in the room. Often one of the challenges we have in a polarized environment is that we alike minds end up thinking quite alike, but then there are a lot of other minds that aren't there, or other people aren't there. And so I think it's important for people to not only think about not what they think might be good for them, but also be thinking about the broader community. So, and that might be thinking about ways in which we could be helpful to folks who are unemployed now, if in that level, people from different ethnic backgrounds, if they're not part of your regular group, different class backgrounds, and an idea about all those different factors in terms of how the economy is working or not working for those folks, and what kind of policies are going to put them in the best stead. So, for instance, we've had horrible differences in access to healthcare for a long time, and one of the consequences of that is the number.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, I know you had something going on. So do I need to say some stuff over again?
Yeah, I think you need, where you ended up and it froze was talking about access to healthcare.
Okay, all right. So you will be editing it. And your background stuff. Yeah, I wasn't sure. I wasn't sure it was on my end or your end or both. I'm not quite sure what was going on. But yeah, this is like, this isn't cool. But anyway, yeah, one of the things we've noticed during COVID-19 is that that access to healthcare is quite different. So African Americans have died at a much higher rate than whites have, and part of that had to do with the fact that there are more African Americans were concentrated in center cities. But the bigger part of it is that a lot of them have underlying health needs that have not been properly addressed because they haven't had the same kind of access to healthcare that whites have. And that goes back to broader issues of historical discrimination and so forth, that in the wealth differences that go on. I mean, I've been reading a book about 3 individuals who have migrated from the South during the early parts of the 20th century, and all the different things that they went on. And there's just so many ways in which our country has pushed down folks who are African American and made it really hard for them to put themselves on an equal footing. So I think those kind of things are really important for people to keep in mind as they're thinking about voting. And then also our democratic rights, that it's really important that people have access to voting. There's been a lot of movement in this country to limit people's access to voting, and that's not a good thing. So I mean, we should have seen a broad dialogue about how under COVID-19 we should be, what kind of changes do we need to make sure everybody has an equal access to vote, and that hasn't been the case. We've seen a split on that issue, unfortunately, and I think in Wisconsin, we saw people having to vote during a pandemic in person, and standing in line, and that just shouldn't happen ever. So people just need to stand up, and especially perhaps in honor of John Lewis, really think about ways in which we can change laws to make sure that access to voting, which historically, again, has been something that's been denied many people in this country, is something that we don't have to worry about again, that actually that's protected.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much, David, for your time and your thinking and your heart. I love the way that you combine just clear thinking about public policy and also a heart and compassion for those in our society who have been left out. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Doug. Good to join you.
Goodbye.
All right.